Hello and welcome to another episode of 10 Questions About Film, a podcast where I ask filmmaker friends, as it says on the tin, 10 questions all about film and their filmmaking process, in an attempt to understand this crazy industry we find ourselves in. In this episode, I talked to filmmaker, actress and horror aficionado, Emma Dark. Emma is an award-winning filmmaker and actress, co-directing her first film, horror short Island of the Blind Dead, in 2014. Since then, she has directed several films, including Seize the Night, winning the Rising Star Award at the Yellow Fever Independent Film Festival and the Outstanding Female Filmmaker Award at the Stormy Weather Horror Festival in 2017. Her sci-fi horror Salient -10 premiered at the British Horror Film Festival in 2017. The film went on to win a slew of awards, including Best Director at the Starburst Magazine Media City Festival in 2018. Determined to raise awareness of women in film, Emma has graced the front cover of independent filmmaker magazine Digital Filmmaker, as well as hosting the magazine's monthly Ask the Filmmaker section as the resident expert. She's been a guest speaker at several film discussion panels, focusing on female leaders in the film industry, and appears regularly as a guest at many conventions across the UK, including Birmingham's MCM Comic Con and Sheffield's HorrorCon, and has been a judge at various film festivals. Emma is also a contributing writer for We Belong Dead magazine, with her Rondo Award-nominated column, Dark Corner. She is currently in pre-production on her new film. So, question one. Tell me about yourself. What's your background? What have you done?
Hi, Craig. So, I'm a filmmaker, award-winning filmmaker, independent film, I should add. Going back in time, so before the filmmaking, I actually started out front of camera. So I was doing a bunch of modelling stuff. And from that, I ended up in music videos, front of camera. And I really loved the filmmaking process. And also, to be clear, I have done film before that. However, it's kind of corporate and commercial stuff. It's not horror or genre or anything like that. But I really loved the kind of genre film and, you know, the filmmaking process for that. And through doing those things, I just thought, okay, well, why aren't I doing this? You know, I was doing a lot of other things at the time that was getting my name out there. You know, it's good to be front of camera, don't get me wrong. It's really nice to have great pictures of yourself, and it's really cool to see yourself on screen. I mean, it's all very glamorous, that side of things. But for a creative person, there are limitations with that. You can kind of help produce with a photographer or, you know, potentially offer ideas and stuff if you're front of camera for other people's projects, but it's not your project, so...
So your way in was really through acting. Was that something that you'd fell into, or was it something you'd always wanted to do? Or?
Well, I mean, strangely enough, going back really far in time, when I was first looking at the kind of things I wanted to do, acting was a potential, although it was still more of the creative side of things. So, you know, photography, being a creator, filmmaker, etc. But yeah, I did end up kind of falling into acting through the modelling stuff. And I ended up falling into the modelling through joining a photo meetup group as a photographer. So yeah, it's all a bit roundabout, I'm afraid.
Well, I think most people's careers are a bit like that. I mean, for me, I got into it through acting, funny enough, as well.
Okay.
But I joined a youth theatre at the tender age of about 11. But prior to that, I'd been shooting loads of Super 8 films since I was about 8. And,
oh, wow.
You know, making film stars of all my friends, really.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. And, you know, but the thing is, I quickly understood that I wasn't good enough an actor to do it. And for me, it became about storytelling, really. And so that then it was about writing stories to act in with my friends in the youth theatre. But as that developed, I started making films with them. And started falling into directing. So it was more along that way. But I do think that most people's career paths are a bit like that. I mean, you know, when I was speaking to David Wilkinson, his was the same. He started in acting and then gradually moved into producing and directing.
Yeah.
Do you think that having had that experience in front of camera has helped you in terms of your directing style?
I think so, yeah, because I can appreciate when somebody's standing around freezing cold. Yeah. That's for a start. I do think I can appreciate the perspective the other person's coming from. Like I said, it's not always glamorous. It's a lot of standing around and horrible temperatures and stuff sometimes. And I think just helping the actor get into the right headspace to play the role, just kind of easing them into that part, really.
Well, it's what I call the 3 o'clock in the morning in a snowy field holding a light stand sort of thing, isn't it? Everyone thinks of it as being glamorous red carpet and paparazzi, but the truth is most of it is stood in a muddy field at ridiculous times of the day, or the cold, damp places underground, especially when you're making horror,
Yeah.
I guess this really feeds into the next question, which is question number 2. What was the spark? When did you know that this was how you were going to spend the rest of your life, really?
Well, I think with the narrative filmmaking. So, I mean, I had, like I told you, I have done corporate and web advert type things before, which is a whole different ballgame. And I had done some experimental film work. I wouldn't go as far as call it horror, maybe more art house. But those are things that just fell by the wayside, not the stuff I would put out, really, just kind of test pieces. Yeah, I think when I started properly on narrative film, which properly was Seize the Night, that's my first festival film.
Yeah.
And I got involved in so many different aspects of that filmmaking. And for me, it just brought all of those elements together that I like, all of those creative elements. Also, it stretched me. There were things that I hadn't done before that I had to do. And I just like that whole rounded process. And, it does include all the elements of, like you said, storytelling, the visuals, everything really that I like.
With regards to Seize the Night, I mean, it's obviously a very visual film. Yeah. What led to the decision to have such a stylized grade on it?
So I've been asked that one a few times, and it wasn't necessarily intentional.
Right, okay.
I did want to put a grade on it, don't get me wrong. I definitely did want to do that. But I was planning to have it less desaturated. But there's a scene in a garage and there was loads of hazard flashing everywhere. And if you look closely now, you can still see the yellow coming through from that. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't really got into the realms of secondary colour grading and stuff like that at the time. So the only real solution was to desaturate it. I didn't want to just make it black and white. That wasn't really what I was going for at all. So then I just put a heavier colour cast on it, basically, a sort of bluey-green colour cast.
So it was kind of adapting to solve a problem, and then out of that, the creative process led to a very stylized grade, which I think actually works in its favour. It gives it a real unique vibe to it.
Yeah, I think it's quite nice, but it took me quite a long time to get there. And I believe I did actually release the first version of the trailer, which was more just blue, and it just wasn't really working for me. So when I cut the whole film, I did change the grade again.
Is horror something you've always wanted to do, or was that something that you kind of came to later, a moment when you kind of went, oh, actually, that's my path, that's where I want to go? So
in terms of horror, I've always loved horror. Mm-hmm. Ever since a kid, I fell in love with horror films, horror books, horror everything, pretty much. So that's something that's always been part of my life. Yeah. So it just seems to me that it's natural to do horror. I would expand into other genres. One of my films does touch on sci-fi a bit more and dark fantasy. That's fine. I'm not sure I'd ever do a rom-com. Unless there was some horror, unless there's a horror element or something.
Yeah, well, it could be, vampire and werewolf fall in love.
Well, it could be, yeah, exactly. But yeah, I'm not adverse to anything. I'm not adverse to other genres. Just, for my own personal stuff, it's got to be something I'm passionate about, right? And it's got to be something that an audience is passionate about watching for that kind of level of indie filmmaking. Indie filmmaking horror does have quite a reasonable audience, so...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Was it more of a choice of this is a more practical route to go, or was it just a love of horror?
Yeah, both probably.
Okay, good mixture. Yeah, I think the same here, because I mean, my first film, we filmed it in a big old haunted house down in Compton in Sherborne in Dorset over 45 days or 45 nights, really. And it was exactly the same. I looked around, I'd graduated from film school and said, well, what have I got that I could make a film with? And the two things I had, a group of friends who we'd all made films together with, and a location that I knew I could have access to because we'd used it in one of our short films and it belonged to one of our group of friends. And his parents were just about to sell it. So they said, come on in and use it for as long as you want until we sell it. And that's what we did. So we basically lived in this big old spooky house, and managed to make a horror movie over these 45 days with, you know, half a script, really. It was sort of 75 pages of treatment and a lot of improvisation and a lot of experimentation. But we got there, and we got it to a point where it kind of worked. And then, you know, we managed to sell it to a distributor in America, and now it's available, which is great.
That's amazing, yeah.
But it, you know, it was a kind of concerted choice on my part, going, well, actually, these are the things I've got, so I can make something with this, as opposed to, right, I must do horror. Although, much like yourself, I grew up with Hammer House of Horror films and absolutely obsessed with horror, loved it. Saw far too many horror films as a child because my mum was really into watching horror films for some reason. Although she's not a horror fan, but it's really funny. You know, she introduced me to all these crazy films. So sci-fi and horror are my two things, my two loves. But coming out of film school, it was obvious I couldn't afford to make a sci-fi film. And horror seemed like a really obvious route. But the enjoyment of that was the freedom of it. I think the beauty of horror for me is that you can talk about anything without being on a soapbox, but you can still talk about really important issues, or you can just make something really horrible. And that's the, you know, that's the joy of it, really. I don't know about you, but I find that people read their own meanings into a lot of your films anyway.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, they really do. It's quite interesting what you said about the improv stuff as well, because I think a lot of times there's pressure to have everything down, to have a complete storyboard, to be, you know, very prescriptive in your filming. Yeah. Which I get. I mean, that can help with time, definitely time management. But when you think about all those Italian giallo films, they would just go off script at the time, just to, you know, if the location was to change, they were prepared to change things in improv at the last minute, and they're great films.
I'm a big believer in, when you get into the location, letting the actors play in that location and not being too rigid about things. It's taken me a long time to get there. I think, you know, in the early days, I used to be like, I've storyboarded, I've shot listed, we have to do this. But then you find, you know, that, again, on that film that I was just talking about, Through the Looking Glass, I'd written pages and pages and pages of these big sort of speeches that the main character was meant to deliver. And actually, you know, once you get into the location and you get into the vibe of it, you just kind of realize you don't need half that stuff. So it was easy to chop that and allow the actor to do what he needed to do with that material, just cherry picking the bits. And then the rest, it was all internal. It was all in his performance.
Exactly. Well, that, and also if you want to change a scene or something like that, or change the way that you had in your mind that you were going to shoot something. Yeah,
it made a massive difference. But also, I think living in that environment together as a group of people, there was about 15, 16 of us in there over that time, you know, and working till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, then finishing half a bottle of whiskey. You know, it was quite rock and roll. But, you know, it led to a group dynamic, and it was a very collaborative process. Now, how do you work on set? Is it more of a collaborative process, or is it more that I have these ideas and that's what I'm going to stick to?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to stick to my ideas when I'm making a film. I'm happy for people to offer suggestions, because you never know, something could be better. But usually I do want to stick to my ideas. I do work quite closely with the actors and the crew beforehand and have rehearsals, etc., and things like that. So hopefully anything too major gets ironed out before actually shooting. And I tend to work with people I really get on well with and we're on the same creative wavelength. So I also think that helps as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's always, you're skating that thin line, aren't you, between improvising off script to such a point that you lose control of it, and then needing to bring it back to get your shots done in a set day. Yeah, you know, even just from a practical point of view. So let's move on. Question number 3. Who's your biggest hero or influence?
Oh, okay. So I don't have one single person who would be my biggest influence. There's lots of different things that I like. In terms of filmmakers, probably Stanley Kubrick for the more kind of art house aspects. Yeah. But then there's like a whole bunch of other people that inspire me. Like, for example, Jake West.
Yeah, I know.
British horror filmmaker. His stuff's fantastic. There's loads of people that I know personally on the indie film scene that I find inspiring, as well as kind of big Hollywood directors. So it's kind of hard. I don't really have one influence. But I think if you want to go back pretty far in time, Albert Pune's The Sword and the Sorcerer, I watched that as a kid. I probably shouldn't have been watching it as a kid. I think my parents thought it was a kid's film.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was watching this film and I thought it was fantastic. And it's not a horror, but I don't know if you remember the opening scenes, but they're pretty dark. The prosthetics that are going on and the animatronics are pretty dark and scary.
Yeah.
And things like that were an influence to me. And then weirdly, a lot of these things, they come full circle in life, because then later on I connected with Albert on Facebook and we'd chat and he'd send me some links for drafts of his films.
Oh, amazing.
And then I won the Albert Pune Inspiration Award at the Yellow Fever Independent Film Festival. And yeah, I mean, it's just kind of strange, isn't it? How these things that you see quite early in life, they do inspire you, and then they kind of come back full circle.
It's amazing. Yeah, I connected with William Friedkin on Twitter one drunken night, and we got into a chat, and it was just the most bizarre thing. And then, because at the time I was crowdfunding for some project, it was like an interactive horror thing that I was doing, and called Night Vision, and he had seen the tweet about it, and just decided to drop me a line just out of the blue. And it was just such a crazy thing, you know, the guy that made The Exorcist.
Yeah.
And I'm talking to him over Twitter, and it was such an exciting thing, you know. We don't talk about Twitter anymore, obviously, but
no.
It's amazing, actually, though, those sort of early sword and sorcery movies of the 80s, a lot of those, they were quite graphic for you know, I was watching Dragon Slayer last night. I don't know if you remember that, but
vaguely.
It's basically Paramount and Disney, and they did a collaboration over a few films, and it was the second collaboration that they'd done together. And it was Hal Borwood, I think, or Matthew Robbins and those guys. And there's a bit in it where it's like a princess who's been dragged into the dragon's cave, and there's like baby dragons gnawing her feet off and stuff, and it's really graphic, and you kind of think, and this is a PG, and it's from Walt Disney, you know, in the 80s, and you kind of think, they'd never do anything like that now. You know?
No. No, they wouldn't. You're right.
No. Yeah. I love those kind of films, though. Question 4. Tell me about your first film. What was it?
Okay, so technically my first film was Island of the Blind Dead.
Yes.
But that wasn't really necessarily intended to be my first film. I'd gone away on holiday, and the other person that I made the film with, it was just to take some pictures of them, kind of dressed up, to possibly promote something that would happen in the future. But then we'd started to talk to some people in a bar, well, the owner of a bar, and he was part of the local Amateur Dramatic Society. And then within 2 days or something, like
it always starts in a bar.
I know, yeah, half the Amdram Society was involved, and I was shooting this film. Yeah, and it was crazy. But it's quite nice. It's quite a nice little homage to Tombs of the Blind Dead.
Those kind of experiences, those films are always the best. I was saying about the one in the youth theatre I was in. We made this kind of detective story one, and it was kind of pseudo Blade Runner-esque, but you know, made with a VHS camera in Cardiff in the 80s, you know. And we had a scene where we're running around, because we were all in the youth theatre together, but we're running around on a rooftop, and we've got guns. They were toy guns. Of course, you know, being kids, we didn't realise you needed to have permits for things like that.
Yes.
So we're running around, and suddenly this armed police response unit turn up. There's loads of them, and they suddenly flood onto the thing. And we've actually got video of the moment they all sort of flood onto the rooftop and kind of, hoi, hoi, hoi,
wow.
Hoi, you know. And it was amazing, those kind of things that you those scrapes you get yourself into, you know, those. And I think you can only do that when it's a bunch of amateur people having a crack at it, you know.
Yeah, you're right. I was going to say as well, I had a similar incident to that. This was just photography. I was taking a picture for someone's album cover, and it was just me and them on the top of a car park by night. But they had it was a guy. He had his top off, and he was wearing a gas mask.
Oh,
and
right.
I mean, okay, it was like for a heavy metal album cover. I didn't think, you know, anything bad would happen. And all of a sudden, a couple of police officers come up, but they were laughing. And they just said, like, security's called us, just move over to this other car park. So,
That's amazing. Didn't look at all dodgy.
No.
So with your first film then, so you co-directed, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
So how did that come about? Was that just purely because you were left holding the baby, as it were?
No, I mean, that was just a trip that was not to do with filmmaking at the time. And it just ended up being a collaborative process. So, yeah, it literally was just born out of a conversation in a bar.
And how did you find that experience of co-directing? Was that frustrating, or was it difficult, or was it easy?
No, it was fine. It was fine because it's quite a brief film, really. I mean, I can't even remember the runtime myself, but it's not long. So, and there were limited people in it as well. And both myself and the other director had to act front of screen as well in it. So, yeah, it was just a collaborative process at the time.
It was all pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Question number 5. What is your worst filmmaking experience, and how has that defined you as a filmmaker?
I don't know 100% that it would be behind the camera. I think sometimes with the acting, that might be more of a problem when you're waiting around in the cold. It's not particularly nice. On the Kim Wilde music video, which is great, but I don't know if you remember or if any viewers have seen that, but I'm wearing like just a corset really and some fake leather trousers and stuff like that. And we kind of had to hang around in sort of reasonably cold weather inside a nightclub, which obviously wasn't heated and stuff. And I just don't think I really bought a thick coat or anything. And I was just kind of hanging around like freezing cold for hours. And by the time they came to actually shoot one of the scenes, I was so cold. I could barely move, and so I do kind of appreciate that from the other side of the fence, shooting in cold weather and making sure that people have got hot drinks and coats and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Up until COVID, I did quite a lot of extra work to fill in my days between trying to get projects up and running. I remember doing days on Gladiator.
Oh, lovely.
Down in Bournemouth, down in Farnham. Yeah, it wasn't so lovely, though, because you turn up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You get into the costume, which is big, heavy. I was one of the German barbarians at the beginning. And you get kitted out in all this fur, but it's all really smelly and horrible because it's all fake. And then they put you basically in a mud bath, cover you in mud. Ooh. In this tent, and then they chuck you out, and then you go and have a bit of breakfast. You go to makeup, and they put this prosthetic axe wound on the side of your face, and then they chuck you out into the woods, and it's snowing for real because it's February, and it's like 7 a.m. and you're just stood there going, "Why am I doing this?" But then on the plus side, half an hour later, you literally stood next to Richard Harris and Russell Crowe and Ridley Scott, and he's directing the two of them. And that kind of experience is invaluable to see how, at that level, them doing that.
You can look back on it and kind of forget that you were cold or sweaty or, whatever was going on at the time.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that happened on that, which was really funny, was that they were all on a break. And so all of us extras got really, we were just stuck outside, freezing cold. And so someone took one of the heads off of one of the dead bodies and we started playing football with it. And 10 minutes later, they all come back, and the first AD went absolutely ballistic.
Well, I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine that would happen.
I know. But it was just, there were so many of us, they couldn't get us all back to holding and then back in time, so it was just like, stay put there for 15 minutes. But it was horribly cold. Well, then conversely, question 6 is, what's your best filmmaking experience, and how has that helped you as a filmmaker?
I think this is actually kind of similar to before. I think my best filmmaking experience has come from making mistakes and those kind of times when you're cold or, whatever on set, and you learn from those mistakes.
Sure.
So, for example, season 9, I mean, that was absolutely freezing. If anyone watches that, you can see Paul Ewan in his scene. He billows this great big breath, and people have said, "Oh, was he smoking?" He wasn't. It was absolutely freezing. It was absolutely freezing. And working in those conditions, with it being that cold, it's not pleasant. And there were some scenes where, because it was cold, because there was quite a bit of makeup involved, we were quite slow to start. and we'd run out of time on the location and had to go back. That happened with a couple of scenes. Unfortunately, there was one shot, actually it was a really cool place, and we just didn't get the footage because of time constraints. And I ended up not being able to rebook that place, so we had to go somewhere else. But yeah, I just think you learn from these things, really.
So as a director, how do you psychologically cope with that frustration of that moment, you know, knowing you're not going to get the shots you want, knowing you're not going, what's your process through that?
Oh, well, trust me, I've tried even up to the last 15 minutes or something left on a location, and like the owner's saying, okay, we need to start packing up, you know, we've got to go now, the venue's shutting or something. So it's basically, I don't give up at the time of filming. I just try and get as much as possible. And ideally, if you can go back and you can recreate the exact same lighting, etc., then you can pick up where you left off. But that hadn't quite been the case with what I'd shot. It's just a case of tenacity and just having to push through it, because there are things that will get thrown at you and you just think, oh, why am I doing this, you know? But I would never give up, because the amount of people involved, and all of those people, you know, they're excited to be part of something, you know, and you've got to think of everybody on board your project. They deserve you finishing your project to the best of your ability and getting it out there.
Well, absolutely. If you've got investors as well, you know, as a director, you have a responsibility to them to actually produce a product that potentially will make them a return on investment. So, you know, and you are contractually obliged to do that, if nothing else, you know.
Exactly.
So,
exactly. I mean, luckily or not with my stuff, because it's been short narrative filmmaking, it's all been crowdfund based.
Yeah.
So,
but they're still investors, though, aren't they? Really, effectively.
Well, they are because, and I've seen people take money for films and not produce them, and you know, obviously it's all blown up and stuff, and I can see both sides of the fence. But at the end of the day, if people have paid out the money in good faith, you have to deliver. I'm
of the belief that if people are working on deferred payments, then they're essentially investors in your film as well. But regardless 100%. Of whether they're sound guy or a runner or an actor, they're investing their time essentially for free. So, you know, they are an investor in your film. So I think you have a responsibility to them as well. I think that's something that gets lost sometimes in the crowdfunding scene, is that, you know, it doesn't really matter. But I think these things do matter, and I think they do affect your career long term.
Yeah.
You know, I think you have to look at those things and treat everyone that's working towards your film as an investor.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen, you know, people not necessarily be respected a couple of times on film sets and stuff as well. And I don't agree with that. I mean, everyone's there because they believe in you, they believe in your project, and you have to treat people well. And yeah, the same with your investors and crowdfunders.
I totally agree. Everybody on set is equally important. They need to be there. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. It's not all about you as a director, I think.
Exactly.
I mean, I had that very experience as a runner years ago. I was a runner at a fairly big music video production company. I won't mention any names for obvious reasons. And I was working on a music video for a very big American band. And we ended up doing a 24-hour shift. And
blimey.
I was getting sent out for runs left, right, and centre. And in those days, you bought whatever it was you were sent out for, and then you would put a claim in on petty cash. And so they wouldn't give you money. They just send you out. Go and get these. Go and get that. Go and get this. And then you would come back to the production company, and then you would give them the receipts, and then they would reimburse you, which I think is crazy. I mean, you know, I don't even know how that was legal, but that's what was happening. And the production manager, again, who I won't mention names, but was just horrific, terrible to us. But then a few years later, I was directing a music video, and her boyfriend was one of the actors in the music video. So she came down to set and hung out and was as nice as pie to me all day long, just going, oh, you're brilliant, you're this, you're that, you know, blowing smoke up my backside. And I was just like, at the end of the day, I just turned around and said, you don't remember me, do you? And she went, no. I said, we've met before. And she went, have we? And I mentioned the name of the video, and she was like, her face just went white. Just went really white. No. So, you know, I think you've got to be really careful about how you treat people, because it comes around, you know. The way we were treated at a professional level, thankfully now, I do think the industry is starting to wake up to this and change things. I mean, you know, recently, was it Richard E. Grant who talked about his daughter as a runner and what she's gone through. I mean, I do think the industry is changing in that regard, and I think it's also changing towards the way women are treated in it. Thankfully, these things are important, the way we treat people on set. And to me, I think it's really important that you include people in the process, because again, if you include them in the process, they feel like they're part of it. They feel,
which they are,
and then they're invested in it, and they want to work hard and make sure it succeeds. I think it's just really basic courtesy, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I agree, 100%.
Yeah. Question number 7. How did you get your first film sold or distributed? Was it through a company or did you self-distribute?
I would like to say it was sold or distributed, but no, it wasn't. So because it's a short film, and unfortunately, by about the time that I'd finished that, sites like maybe Shudder, for an example, they did used to support short films and have quite a lot on there. But, a lot of these sites, they've stopped doing short films. So there were only really a couple of options, and I could have distributed it on Amazon Prime myself, which, although it would still be by me, it would have had a little bit more kudos maybe because it's Amazon Prime. But it was putting a payment gateway on that, which I didn't really want for digital. So I ended up just putting it on YouTube. But what I also did, which I had to do anyway for casting, career backers, etc., I made a DVD release. So I designed an artwork to all of the cover art, DVD art, made like little lobby cards and like special edition stuff to go with it, and distributed that basically, just to make quite a small run of those. Maybe I think I might have made 100, 150 discs, something like that. And I took those around conventions and stuff as well.
So you're quite a big player on convention scene, I guess, all right?
Yeah.
And how has that helped?
Oh, it really helps. I mean, unfortunately, there's been a bit of a crash with conventions, which happened a few years ago. There were tons and tons of horror conventions popping up, and they were really good. But I think maybe for the UK, it might have been too many, and they just ended up in a big crash. So there's not that many horror conventions now. But when there was a good run of them, it was great to go around those as a signing guest and, take the DVDs, and sometimes they'd screen the film and stuff like that, or you do a Q&A. And I think it's really good. It really helps indie filmmakers. And I even got to do MCM Birmingham as well, which was great. So, yeah. Well,
I suppose it's building up a grassroots support, isn't it? That, a fan base, which is really what any filmmaker really should be doing anyway. So to me, it makes perfect sense. How did you get involved with that? Was that something, were you invited or did you?
Yeah. I can't remember the first one I was invited to be 100% honest. I'd have to probably check my bio. But yeah, I did HorrorCon UK. But that was a good one because they screened my film and I did a Q&A there as well. And I got to sit next to Sean Hudson, who's one of my favourite writers. And it just there was just a whirlwind of loads and loads of conventions for a good couple of years.
But I suppose in the process, it's helping to establish you as a filmmaker and build a fan base.
That and magazine support as well.
Yeah.
I've had interviews in Dark Side magazine. Starburst have been very supportive as well.
Yeah, they're great. I've had a couple of reviews in there and they are great,
And lots of the sort of big name horror sites, Dread Central, etc.
How easy have you found it to get things reviewed?
Relatively easy. For the most part, I think people have given quite nice, well-rounded reviews. I think I've only ever had one which was scathing. But
they're always the best.
I don't know. Well, this scathing review, then some of the fans of the film got involved in conflict with the site that did it. So it got a little bit out of hand. Yeah. But I think you've got to accept that some people are going to absolutely hate what you do and some people are going to absolutely love it. And for the most part, with reviews, people, they'll give a good critique. So,
yeah. Okay, moving on. Question 8. What does it mean to you to be a filmmaker? How would you describe what you do?
For me, filmmaking, I mean, obviously I focus on the directing side of things because that's kind of what people understand. And I think, people can put you in these categories, either you're an actor or a director. But I do a lot of things. I edit as well. I do shoot some stuff, colour grading. Sound is not something I really do, or score. But I like that fully kind of rounded process. I like doing lots of different things. So that's what a filmmaker means to me. It's not just being a director or just writing the script and directing and sort of farming the other stuff out and just approving it. So that's more what it is to me.
I also think these days, there's no excuses not to get your hands dirty with that stuff as well, because with modern technology, it's so easy to get involved in everything. I mean, you can download DaVinci Resolve for free, and it's broadcast standard quality. I recently bought an Osmo Pocket 3 camera because Don McVie has been talking about them with his documentary he's shooting with David Wilkinson. And it's a tiny little camera with a gimbal. And it's absolutely fantastic, what you can achieve with it. And so I think there's no reason these days not to be a well-rounded filmmaker. And I think also these days you have to be honest, because budgets are getting tighter all the time.
Exactly.
I think you have to have a hand in everything, really.
Yeah, and you're probably the same as me by the sounds of it. But I mean, there really are some people that they can't shoot, or they can't edit and stuff. So that's no disrespect to those people.
No.
Just for me, I think that I can. Hopefully other people agree. So I like to do it.
Yeah, I think it's really important to do that. I mean, I've always since digital came along, I was a real early adopter. Much like yourself, I used to do little test films. So what I would do is I would get a 400-foot canister of 16mm, and I would basically say, right, well, on this film, I'm going to test how to do a certain type of shot, or I'm going to test how to use the shutter, or I'm going to test how to create an atmosphere through sound. I would do tests like that. I'd shoot the film, and they would cost me somewhere between £600 to £800 to make. And I would do them as a short film, but really they were just little tests, so I would learn something new on each one. And then around 1999, 2000, I think digital started to come in with cameras like the Canon XL1. And so I bought one of them as soon as possible, because I think they were about £2,000, which was quite a lot at the time for what I was spending. But then I was spending that on 2 or 3 short test films. So I think it's good to keep abreast of the new stuff that's coming in and use it, but not get too caught up on it. The beauty of digital now is you can make those mistakes and learn from it in a way that you could never do with film, because film was just too expensive to do it. Whereas now you can literally, with your iPhone, you could shoot a feature film with your iPhone, no problem at all. And in fact, 28 years later, it's just been shot on an iPhone. So, although very expensive lenses as well, and massive lighting kits, which is, like with 28 Days Later, they shot it on a Canon XL1, and they made a big deal of that. But the truth was, they had huge lenses attached to that camera that were, really expensive lenses. So, of course, it's going to look better than your home consumer one. Question number 9. Tell me about the best gadget or tool that helps you as a filmmaker.
If we're talking about physical thing, it is my camera.
Yeah. What camera is that?
A Sony AS7 Mark II. Yeah, it's a mouthful. Sadie at -10, which is my second festival film, was shot on that. Not actually my camera, it was Philip Bloom's camera.
Yeah.
But I just love the aesthetic, and I do use that camera quite a lot for photography as well. So it is a useful piece of kit. Because it's a mirrorless, it's quite small, and quite inoffensive if you need to go out and film something with it. That's probably my favourite bit of kit that I've got. In terms of other things, like editing suites, I use Premiere Pro. I know we've talked about DaVinci, and I think Premiere Pro is a bit of a mixed opinion on that, but I do love it because I love the whole Adobe suite. So
I think with any of the non-linear editing packages or any post packages, it's what you've acclimatized to. I know people who still rave about Final Cut, but I made the move to DaVinci during COVID, and to be honest, I really get on with it. I really love it. But I also understand that there's not a lot of difference between all of them, really, at that point.
No.
They do the same job. So it's just what you're comfortable. Much the same with cameras. I mean, you can always have pros and cons for each camera, but it's really what suits you, and more importantly, what suits your story.
Well, like you said as well, I mean, you can just shoot something on a mobile. There's nothing wrong with that. But like you said, if you want to do more with it, you're probably going to have different lens kits and stuff to go with it, and not just the mobile itself. But you can shoot. If you've got a really good story, what's stopping you just shooting a mobile?
But I think it always comes down to the lens anyway, whatever you're shooting.
Yeah.
You have to have the right sort of lens for the right kind of story. I mean, you don't necessarily want to be shooting, horror with the most pristine glass anyway. Like Host, for example, which was shot on Zoom. It works perfectly because of that. If that had been shot on, 35mm, say, or 70mm, or on, on an Alexa, it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't have the same vibe. It just wouldn't work.
Yeah, I have watched that, and there's a whole spate of kind of similar films as well, aren't there?
Yeah.
Like, is it Darknet?
Yeah.
And I love those. I think they really work.
As I said, I think the format has to really be dictated by the story that you're telling and the vibe of the story you're telling. I don't think Blair Witch would have worked if it had been shot like a normal film. Obviously, the conceit of it, also that roughness of edge of it.
Yeah, well, that was supposed to be found footage, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're at the end. You'll be glad to know. Question number 10. Finally, what is the one thing you wish someone had told you when you first started out?
I don't know, really. Yeah, I don't think there would be one thing. I just think a lot of this stuff, I just dove straight into it. I just went in off the deep end and just made my own way, made my own mistakes on things.
Yeah.
So it would have been nice to have a bit of mentorship. You know, I mean, not to say I haven't had advice from friends and stuff, and I know lots of people on the same wavelength to me. But I did just dive straight into it. So I probably made a lot of mistakes I didn't need to make as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, though, you do learn from them. So
a really vital part of the process, though, is making those mistakes, because by making the mistakes, sometimes you get happy little accidents where things just fall into place perfectly, and you end up with really interesting moments, which I think sometimes if you don't make those mistakes in the first place, you don't get.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
On that track, then, is there any advice that you would give someone just starting out?
I would say just think where you want to be in 5 or 10 years' time with your filmmaking, and kind of make your films going towards that goal. I think for me, I didn't really have a goal apart from just to make the best films that I could. And I won't lie, horror puts some people off. You know, it's a sad fact.
There is a obviously well-established massive audience for horror, so it is a very good breeding ground.
Yeah, but I think sometimes you need to kind of show you can do a range of things. So maybe if you make everything all-out horror constantly 24/7, that might not be the best approach. So maybe what I'm saying is don't necessarily fall into what your audience expects from you. Follow your own vision.
To me, that just all makes sense. Is, have a 5-year plan. Lay out where you want to be and how to achieve that. Have steps from point A to point B, and stick to your own vision as much as you possibly can. Obviously, filmmaking is always a compromise, but it's being willing to compromise, I think, on the things that don't affect your vision massively or fundamentally. But that's always the hard part, isn't it? Because that's where you can get lost in your vision for something and lose sight of what it is that you're actually making. Because, again, to bring this back to the first film that I made that I was saying, Through the Looking Glass, my original idea for it was to be a very avant-garde art house horror. And it is that, but in the process of doing that, I think I completely lost sight of telling a story, a very simple, basic story. And so when it came to editing, it meant there was a lot more work to have to get it into shape, and then having to do a lot of pickups and reshoots to make things work fundamentally. That's the problem, is you sometimes get so caught up in the vision that you lose sight of the story. And I think fundamentally it always has to come back to story.
Yeah.
Whether you're telling that visually or through dialogue or through camera movement, or however you're telling that story, you still have to have that story be clear to people.
I think because Caesar Night is a vampire film, and a couple of the things I've been involved in front of camera had been vampire film, I think a lot of people that were following those projects would be quite happy if I only ever made vampire films. So this is what I'm saying, that you can fall into what your audience wants.
Yeah.
Or you can have your vision and kind of stick to your vision. And mine is mostly horror, but it's a lot of different kind of things. So
the only other thing I really wanted to ask was just to see what you're up to next, really, or if you're in the middle of a project, anything that you can talk about.
Yes, I'm in pre-production on my next short film. I've written the script, I'm working on a teaser poster, and it will be a horror again. It'll be a bit of a different kind of horror. It's something I've wanted to make for a while. It will be a tech horror, not like super, super tech, but it's got some tech stuff in there. So I can technically call it a tech horror. Yeah, and it will kind of be a bit more demonic. Maybe that's all I can give away about that.
Demonic tech.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a whole new subgenre.
Well, there pretty much is, yeah. But that's what I'm working on at the minute. So hopefully, with these things, it takes a while to work on pre-production, and all of a sudden it's full swing, full steam ahead. So
when do you think you'll be shooting?
ASAP, really.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it might be in the cold again if that's the case. So.
Well, we're coming into the winter, so I guess so. Where can people go to find out more about your work?
Yes, if they just go to my website, www.emmadark.com, then it's got links off to everything on there. So.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Emma. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
A massive thanks to Emma for being a guest on the show. You can find out more about Emma and her films at allthews.emmadark.com, www.emmadark.com. This has been a Workshop Presents production. Music by the ever-great Christopher Nettleton. If you like this episode, why not check out some of the others when they're available? Thanks for listening. See you next time.